Hi, everybody. This is Riz Ahmed, Chief Research Officer here at SAP Insider, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Brent Schroeder, who is head of the Office of the CTO with SUSE. Brent, welcome to the conversation. How are you today?
Thanks, Riz. I'm doing great and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's start, Brent, with you just telling the SAP Insider audience a little bit about yourself, your
Mhm.
role, a little bit about your background, some of your passions, both inside and outside the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, well, I always like to tell people that I've been on the user side in this world. I was a DBA coming out of college and spent a few years on that side, working with the tools and dealing with vendors and the hype of where things were going. So, lived that world for a while, and then eventually I switched over to the engineering ranks. I spent 14 years in the offices of CTO at Dell. Uh, and then next week will be my 5 year anniversary here with
Congratulations.
SUSE. So it's amazing how fast time goes these days. The farther I find, the farther that you go, then the faster the time moves, it seems. Uh, but from a passion standpoint, one thing I've really been fortunate with is as a CTO and working in the office as CTO. It's a fast moving world where you always kind of get to see what's next. And I'd say that's really a passion inside of the work environment is what technology is coming and how is it going to affect business and where are the opportunities that are created by the emerging technologies and also which ones are going to fail because probably as many or more fail than actually have an impact and succeed. So that's really the exciting part that I get to participate in this industry every day. And then outside of work, I get completely away from technology. I love fitness and I spend a lot of my spare time competing in obstacle course racing. So getting dirty and climbing around.
That's great. I'm sure those skill sets really do you well when you're for your job as well as you deal with challenges
Yeah,
and obstacles
dealing with challenges.
mentally
Yep,
and physically, correct?
absolutely, absolutely.
That's right. Well, Brent, thanks so much for joining us again. Our topic really is about running SAP S/4HANA in the cloud. It's a really important topic as
Mhm.
we're seeing because most of our customers are either evaluating or early on in their journey to S/4HANA and the cloud.
Yeah,
When you think about SAP and moving SAP to the cloud,
yeah.
I know there's some misconceptions. People think when they move it, oh, it's all set, they're taking care of everything. Can you talk a little bit about, you work with a lot of different clients
Yeah.
on this journey. So what are some of the common misconceptions that you see when people are at the beginning and what's important for our audience to know about the reality of this?
Yeah. Uh, well, I'm going to break it down into three areas, I think, in the common misconceptions. Uh, First is from an operations and lifecycle management. As I said, IaaS is just virtualization where somebody else owns the data center, right? Uh, and so there is a tendency to have the conception of, okay, I know how to run my virtual environment on-prem. I just put it there and I'm going to run it, right? And yes, it's virtual, but no, it's not the same. Uh, because the way every cloud puts themselves together is they have their services, their tools, their operating best practices, and topologies about how their cloud works. Uh, and so, in some aspects, can be much simpler than on-prem. That you don't have to worry about the data center. And then some aspects you really have to understand the nuances of how networks work, right? Because it's very different in networking in the cloud and how you're going to network that cloud data center back to your private data centers and connect everything together. So that's probably one of the major differences. And one of the things that I would highlight right there about that misconception is underlying that and to really simplify automation is so critically important. Utilizing the tools that the vendors provide to build best practices and configuration governance and compliance. Second is in the area of high availability. Perception. Uh, it's the cloud. It's just always on, right? It
Always there.
just works.
Yeah.
Uh, and in some ways, yes, but again, that couldn't be farther from the truth. We've all read the headlines of an outage on the cloud. And there are ways to protect yourself against those outages by using multiple zones and regions. And while we won't dive too much into the nuances and the technicalities of them, that's essentially what you're doing if you on-prem, you were setting up multiple data centers and geographical dispersion, et cetera, right? Is protecting yourself from those types of outages. And understanding how to do that is different again than it is on-prem, and there's some definite complexities there that people must understand when they go into it. And then finally, security. The other aspect is, the cloud vendor will take care of my security, right? They're responsible for the infrastructure. They'll make it secure. Well, the vast majority of the security happens above the infrastructure, and that's your responsibility, not the cloud providers. And so it's critical to sit down with the cloud provider and understand where does their responsibility end and where does yours begin? And then take that seriously, because you're just as or even more exposed in the cloud because you've expanded the attack surface. You've created integration points and connection points that you may not have in a completely private environment. And so how do you protect those and do that in a secure manner to protect both the processes and the data that you've got going on out there?
Yeah, no, that's great. So it's not just about handing over your baby and they take care of it.
Yeah, no,
It is, you've got to
whatsoever.
understand those nuances, as you mentioned, because it's not just, there's complexity to the security, the networking piece, and obviously to the development and integration side as well, which we'll
Yep.
we'll get into a little bit later.
Mhm.
When you think of SAP itself, right,
Mhm.
in an on-premise world versus a cloud world, what are some of the common differences between running SAP on-prem and the cloud that people need to be aware of as they go through this?
Yeah. Right. The first thing I pointed out here is that, everything below the OS is different. How you do networking, what a data center looks like, those are very different, right? So that's a different skill set that you're going to have to learn. The tools that you use on-prem, the tools you use in the cloud are very different. What's a virtual data center as a logical construct versus physical data centers? And so that's a completely new set of skills, or a transformed set of skills, let's call it, right? Some of the constructs are the same, but how you work with them and what you have to do is different. Second is, if we then look at the OS and above, everything is conceptually the same. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Is, hey, it feels like a virtual environment, but they're different. So don't assume the tools and best practices are the same just because they look or use some of the same terminology. I'll use an example because I mentioned high availability. We had a very large retailer that was going to the cloud. They had gotten everything set up, moved, did all the work they thought was necessary there, had all their high availability set up, multi-region, all ready to go. And just before go live, they did a final review with us, and we determined that the configuration that they were using was unsupported. Logically made sense,
Right.
but in practice was unsupported, and if an outage had occurred, it would have failed, then brought down the entire system. So that's the key aspect of understand some of these differences of how the regions work versus how two data centers work, and double check that hey, this logically sounds the same. Don't assume that it is the same, because they may functionally provide the same service, but how they work, the nuances behind them, the parameters for latency, for example. The latency between two regions may be very different than the latency between two fiber connected data centers.
Right. Right.
So just that's some of the things to really keep in mind.
So really understand what your expectations are, when you are on-prem and how
Yeah,
they may map or translate. So to your
yeah,
point, don't just assume that everything is just going to be the same,
right,
mapped similarly.
exactly. And this is where, regardless of who you use, when you're first going at it, find a partner that's been there, that because that'll save so much time and headache in helping explain those
Yeah.
differences,
Yeah,
right, and the assumptions.
because I'd imagine, I mean, all the things you're bringing up require a little bit of education and experience, to
Hmm.
your
Yep.
point. So
Yep.
if you're a company that doesn't have a lot of experience in the cloud, that is one way you're saying that there's a lot of expertise you're going to need to understand. So
Yeah.
it's a combination of training, education, and as you mentioned, leveraging the partners that are in your network
Yeah.
that know a bit more, that have worked with a lot of customers in those kinds of scenarios, which
Hmm.
makes total sense. You touched on this idea of business continuity, reliability, disaster recovery, which is, as you know, and as you've stated, is so important to the enterprise customer, the
Hmm.
people, the SAP Insider community it can relate to that. You talked about one sort of misconception and a great story, but are there any other critical sort of takeaways or experiences that you want to convey to the audience when it really comes to this issue?
Um, Probably the other most important one that we find, and there's been years of work into this, and so it's take advantage of it, and don't is automation.
Hmm.
Uh, Initially, when I started here and kind of diving into this area 5 years ago, SAP in the cloud required manual points in the failover and recovery. The industry's been working hard the last few years to remove those. And while, you know, it may seem like, hey, let's leave a couple of checkpoints in here and some manual points of validation and when to move things, our recommendation is to not do that. To really take advantage of automation and get it tested out. Do dry runs, make sure that it's everything's working, test the multiple scenarios. That's probably the most important thing. Is we've done a tremendous amount of work in building an HA and DR infrastructure so that it's kind of blueprinted and by the book. But highly recommend following that because that's where a lot of the traps are when you kind of go it on your own and put in manual steps. Then that just creates opportunity for human failure, which we know occurs far more than failure from the computer side. So.
So another topic that you brought up that I know is a hot button issue for our audience because we see it in the research is this whole security idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you
Mm-hmm.
move, security access to these core business applications is so critical. And then you move to the cloud, and you mentioned it. It's not just assuming that you're secure at this level and every level in between.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. What do customers need to understand about securing that SAP S/4HANA instance in the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different layers to security, right? And so we can talk about many points of it, but uh, unlike in the data center where the vast majority of the time where SAP is running, how it's being used, you kind of put up the traditional perimeter defenses, right? And keep the best approach is just to keep everything out that you can. And many of your endpoints are inside as well and typically protected. And in today's world, not just the data center side going to the cloud and outside your protected four walls, but your endpoints, right, are now probably as often or more often, outside and in the wild. And so really looking for those points of connection and integration.
Hmm.
Is the first part, I would say, from a protection standpoint. Where are all the openings that people can come in, or that you may have exposed in a cloud deployment that you don't have in a private deployment? That would be the first aspect that I would look at.
Can you give me some examples on that, Brent, in terms of like some of those things that might get exposed in that integration scenario that you're talking about?
Well, if you're using the internet as a transport
Hmm.
from endpoints, making sure that you're either in a encrypted connection,
Got it.
so that you don't have that part exposed, that and validate who the endpoints are.
Hmm.
It's easy, there's more and more spoofing and different ways to look like somebody. So protecting that endpoint of knowing who's coming in, and the type of access that they have. And then once things are inside, an area that's still maybe a little bit emerging, and I've seen it on some surveys, listed as an area of high interest, but as an area that we're very highly interested in looking at, is that of zero trust. You're moving data, right? And an exploit will often want that data. And so looking for anomalies in data movement and monitoring anomalies in data movement, is one of those that is really becoming effective at preventing those types of exploits. If somebody gets inside and they've been there a while and now they want to start shuffling data out, you should be able to detect that, hey, wait, why is account information moving outside my network?
Hmm.
Right? Is this going to a known and trusted destination? And if not, don't allow it. So this whole notion of zero trust is one that I think is really becoming important. Another is, and this one I think most people are pretty good at, and is not necessarily specific to the cloud, but I think becomes more important as you get more exposure points, is keeping systems current and up to date, and compliant, and monitoring drift. Don't assume that, hey, I configured it once, and that it's staying the same. We find this all the time in systems that have been set up, and 6 months, 9 months from now, the configuration is not the same. And so monitoring for drift to detect compliance violations and policy violations that you might have, best practices, is another aspect that I think is critically important.
Yeah, so there's anomalies, or as you refer to them as drift, when they're going outside the normal sort of guidelines. And I
Yeah,
imagine you can set up sort of alerts and reports that kind of notify you,
yeah,
kind of like the way
absolutely.
you've talked
Yep.
about automation.
Yeah. Yeah, we've recently introduced some part of our solutions that will do that for you.
Yeah,
We've got the best practices that come with it. You can extend and further define those best practices, and then it'll keep track of all of that for you. And if it sees any drift, alert on that, and help you bring it back into compliance.
that's great. That's great. We're
Mhm.
getting into the meat of our discussion now, which is benefits, right? So we're
Yeah,
talking about a lot of work here, right? It
yeah,
seems like, and a big transition, but there's got to be a purpose for it, and a
yeah,
benefit.
absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Some of the companies, oh, am I going to get higher performance, better
Yeah,
costs, access to innovation? To tell us a
yeah.
little bit about what you're seeing.
Well, I think the first one that people assume they're going to get, and most rightly achieve, uh, is the eliminating the need of the physical infrastructure management, right? I want to focus on my core business, and I don't want to have to, have a team that all they do is manage physical resource uptime and configuration and inventory management, and as the BIOS updated, and what's the capital depreciation rate of that, and when do I got to replace it? So all of those items you can give to the cloud provider. So I think that's an immediate return on skill set and core competency investment. And I put it in that term very purposefully. And so now you can concentrate on your core competencies of I want to focus on SAP. I want to have SAP expertise and focus on the business. Now you still have significant responsibilities in that, so it's not just for free. You still have to manage at the OS and up, which is part and parcel with what comes along with an IaaS environment. But that it still is a significant gain from a skill set standpoint. I'm going to go to costs next, because it goes with the one I was just talking about. Hey, I get rid of all of this resources and so forth, and isn't that just an immediate? I'll write this off the books and I save money. Maybe. And I think this is the one where early on in the cloud era, this was assumed to be, I'm going to just save so much because this is just pennies per hour or per minute, right? It seems trivial. And I say maybe because there's so many factors that go into cost. How operationally efficient were you in your own private data center? What's the variability of your load? So how much extra capacity were you keeping on-prem to handle peaks and valleys? If I've got 40% more capacity than I need because 4 times a year I have to run close in this particular window, and I've got to handle Black Friday and Cyber Monday, but all the rest of the year I've got a bunch of excess capacity, right? So that's a factor that goes into that. The licensing models that you choose to use, do you do subscription? Do you use reserved instances? There's many different nuances far beyond this conversation to understand the pricing models of clouds are very complex. So in the end, to summarize that, some people save money, some people don't.
Don't assume it is what you're saying.
Do not assume. And some people are okay. They may cost more, but the benefits that they got, they believe outweighed those costs. So there's still a positive ROI.
Sure.
So it's just the key is don't assume that, hey, I'm going to take some money and push it right to the bottom line,
right?
Because that may not be the case.
Right.
And you really need to understand those. And one that I think is now really starting to rear its head in that is the data cost. And the part of that I think surprised many people is it's free to put it in, other than the storage cost itself of the platters that you rent. But there's an egress fee. So when you want to take the data out of the cloud, then you get charged on a per capacity, per data moved. And so if you move a lot of data, this is another thing to think about in your cloud migration, right? If you're migrating a lot of this data, a massive database to the cloud, who's consuming it and where are they? And am I going to be extracting data from the cloud? Because that's a significant cost factor. And so keeping that in mind and going in and thinking about your architecture with that in mind. Where are the different apps from a location standpoint? If there's one app that uses a lot of data, you might want to put that app in the cloud as well, so that the data moves within the cloud, which is free,
as opposed to outside
outside.
to cloud.
And then you get a big bill at the end of the month that you were like, where did this come from, right?
Right. And that's in particular for analytics, right? So a lot of companies that might have on-prem analytics sitting in, and they're moving cloud, a data lake into that. You're saying that that's where some runaway costs could be
exactly
had.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep. So then getting to what I think is the biggest benefit is flexibility. We talked about, I've got a bunch of extra capacity because I don't need it. Well, in a cloud model, you can set it up so that you're not paying for the extra capacity, for the majority of the year, and you just reserve a little bit for those particular times. And so you can manage your business much more closely and optimize your costs and your performance. If you get growth that exceeds what you expected, then you can scale up much more rapidly than if you're then having to say, oh my gosh, next quarter is going to be twice as big as this quarter, and we don't have the capacity for that. Calling up your hardware supplier and say, can you expand my data center next week is often a challenge, right? It's very difficult to do. So
Right.
it's that flexibility, I think, is one of the biggest advantages that I find, both in a growth and cost management, performance management standpoint, and being able to scale regionally and globally. All of those things come into play that really are a benefit from a cloud deployment.
Great. Well, thank you for those specific examples, Brent. And I know
Mhm.
what our next conversation is going to be because I think people could use a sort of overview of cloud costs and licensing fees. Anybody can that can
That's
explain that
a
well.
PhD right there.
Exactly. You're like cloud economics degree is what I jokingly tell people.
Yes, there we
Yeah,
go.
but
Uh-huh.
it's absolutely true. Sort
Yeah.
of just a final set of questions for you,
Mhm.
Brent, and I really
Yeah.
appreciate your time. You mentioned skill sets in
Huh?
this last dialogue, and that's a really important thing. And I think people are imagining that now with all the different topics they covered. There might be some knowledge in house that can support some of these things, but there might be a lot of acquisition that needs to be done. And
Mhm.
can you talk about some of the important skill sets that SAP teams need to enhance their organization with, and how
Yeah.
they do that through training, education, partnerships, or any other ways?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, going in without access to cloud specific skill sets is, a recipe for trouble. And clearly, people can train for that. And the expertise is really in understanding that layer, the people that you got rid of, that you didn't have to have. Uh, that understand how the networks work, where the latencies are, how high availability works, how to use the tool sets of the cloud. There's things that I'm used to doing on-prem, and most likely for automation or other things, and most likely those same things can be done in the cloud, and plus more. Uh, but there's going to be different tools with different knowledge and experiences. So finding somebody that has that skill set is critically important to the success of a cloud solution. And to your point, it can be achieved in two ways. One, the jumpstart is partner with somebody, right? To get yourself going, that has that peer skill set that you can work together as a team and gain the transfer of knowledge. That ramp up period to say, I'm going to take, my team of four, my operations team of four, and send them off to school for a while, and not worry about their day job is hard to do.
Yeah.
So by teaming with somebody, you can get that knowledge transference really on kind of an on the job uh, methodology, and you're getting best practices applied to your environment real time versus going off and taking them in a class and then coming back and figuring out all the things that your environment is different than the classroom environment,
Mm.
right? So I'm a huge proponent of that, of teaming for that skill set transference and being able to do it in a very efficient manner. And then choose whether you keep them on, keep somebody on, kind of in a consultative manner, or do you take it over, from an operations standpoint, all yourself as kind of a long-term choice, of how you want to manage your skill sets. So.
Great. Well, Brent, you've given us such great practical insights across this conversation. So I know there's plenty of nuggets in there for our audience. Last thing, any final thoughts or takeaways that you want people to really remember about this conversation, this really important topic that we've covered?
Yeah, I understand that there's a lot of people out there yet that still have to make the journey, make the jump. I think my takeaway would be, why wait? There are people, companies, uh, technologies out there to help the move. We pointed out several of the misconceptions, several of the pitfalls and traps that people can get into. But there's expertise available to help with that move. Whether it's SUSE and ours, we've been doing this for a long time. And have a lot of technology, at hand to help with that migration. And but if it's not us, find somebody and get started. Because what's after you go through the analysis and see the benefits and such, I think there's only upside to be found.
Great. Well, Brent, I want to thank you again for
Mhm.
spending the time with us today and sharing those experiences and insights on a critical topic that is impacting everybody, the
Yeah,
entire community. So thank you, Brent.
absolutely. I appreciate it and enjoyed it.